You are listening to the sound of a completely new screen experience, a startling new kind of excitement. As 20th Century Fox plunges you into the most incredible adventure that man could ever achieve.
Well, Fantastic Voyage was a fantastic voyage. I mean, the 50s had, was kind of the run of the visual effects movies. And then there was kind of like a lull. And then the only thing that really was going on, for the most part, was Ray Harryhausen, of course, who was doing it all himself, pretty much.
Well, I grew up in the 70s, 60s and 70s, and Fantastic Voyage had come out, I think, around 64 or something like that. So I was too young to see it on its initial release. But if you were interested in fantasy or science fiction movies back then, there wasn't a lot to see. And so it's one of those great movies as a kid. If you see it, it kind of inspires you and engages you visually, because it really does have a lot of terrific visual effects in it. I think the visual effects are quite effective. I mean, there are some things that we could do today which would be easier, as far as there were some technical issues with making a film back at that time. All those effect shots were created with what we today call traditional visual effects techniques. So everything that's in the film has to be photographed practically through some sort of mechanical method. And today, of course, we have computer graphic technology, so it's a lot easier to sort of remove the technical flaws that they had to deal with. There are some scenes, for example, where you're inside the submarine looking out and it's shaking.
She won't respond. We're in some sort of current.
Background is kind of what we call scissoring strangely to the foreground because it's not tracked. Today on the computer we can track the background in to make it look like it all belongs together. That was a very difficult thing to do back then because they didn't have that technology, although it's still very effective.
When I look now at Fantastic Voyage, I remember the sort of masochism of photochemical effects. Some of the stuff that was done in that movie was so excruciatingly difficult to do. And just to make a shot without the use of computers where you have control over everything. You're depending so many times on the happy accident.
I think one thing that's so great about the picture is actually it has a great opening. The way the film starts, it sort of has that, it's one of those Cold War spy dramas. It has that sort of aspect to it, and the assassination sequence in the beginning is great. It's a great way to start the picture. And there's that scene in the beginning of the film where the 707 comes in to land at the airport. All those shots are designed very graphically. The DP Ernest Laszlo, the cinematographer, found terrific angles on those airplanes. So you always had perspective lines coming towards you, low angles, graphic shots of the airplane coming in. It's a great way to start your movie, very effectively and very well done. Also, when you got into the credit sequence, there's no dialogue. It's all sound effects. And those sound effects would be signature for many science fiction movies for years to come. You might recognize them in all the Irwin Allen special effects sci-fi TV shows like Lost in Space or things along that nature. And they were called Hickey effects. They were recorded by a soundman at Fox named Ralph Hickey, who originally recorded them for a film called Desk Set, which was a Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn comedy. So they were using they were sound effects created for a big computer, and ultimately they found their way into all these sci-fi movies. They're very recognizable. You can kind of notice that you've heard them a lot if you grew up watching these kinds of films in the 70s. Well, Fantastic Voyage is a great example of what you call a Studio A picture made under the classic studio system, which means that today we much more freelance. We hire different people from different companies to come in and work on a picture. And the model when Fantastic Voyage was made at Fox was that they had different departments in-house that would do everything that needed to be done on the picture.
The studios in the 30s and 40s and 50s all had their own effects departments, and each studio had their kind of secrecy policy, you know what I mean? It was like you were kind of sworn to not let out these little secrets that you had, because you were going to use those to spring more magic on the audience.
Your ID card, please.
And Bill Abbott, for example, he was really great at high-speed photography and using, you know, the way of shooting miniatures and using miniatures.
Bill Abbott was in charge of the visual effects department at Fox, and he would have Emil Cosa Jr., who was a matte painter. There's some matte paintings in the sequence, the miniaturization sequence where there's beams of light, and there's also a really great shot when, right in the beginning of the film, when the car comes to the elevator, and Stephen Boyd is then lowered down. You see a shot of the car going back. There's a matte painting of the shaft that's revealed. So there's nice little matte painting sequences in there as well. So as well as there was a gentleman named Art Cruikshank that worked on the film. And the reason why is that at that particular time, Bill Abbott was very busy with all the work that had to be done at Fox, and he needed help to get this picture done. And he essentially ran into Ub Iwerks. He told me this story and said he's got this picture of Fantastic Voyage and he's very busy. Do you know somebody who can help me? And Ub sent him Art Cruikshank to work on the film. And Art did a lot of the visual effects in the picture so that Abbott could be freed up and do the other things. Now, it was customary at the time for the department head, in this case Abbott, to win the Oscar if a film was nominated. You know, the department heads would essentially win the Oscar. And of course, Abbott worked on the film, but he wanted to make sure that since Cruikshank did the majority of the effects work, that he kept his name off the picture. And Art did win the Oscar, and he told me that he was very proud of that, because Cruikshank was somebody in the trenches at Disney for years who was very capable and very artistic, who never really got recognition. So he was personally very satisfied that he was able to make that happen and have Art get the Oscar for the visual effects on the picture. Richard Fleischer, of course, made Fantastic Voyage, and he was, you know, one of my favorite directors as a kid growing up too, because every film that he made with visual effects won an Oscar. You know, he had directed Tora 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 and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So he always loved to use visual effects in his movies. You know, if you look at his movies, they tell great stories, and he likes to use visual effects. So for me, that was the types of movies as a kid I wanted to see. The Proteus, of course, they built a full-size Proteus in the film, and they used that to good effect, because they not only built a full-size exterior, the interior was built as well. What's great about it is you could get shots outside of the Proteus looking in with your actors, as well as shots inside the Proteus looking out. So usually you don't have a full-size exterior to shoot back into. So that was a nice effect.
In Fantastic Voyage, there's a lot of composite shots. Whenever you see outside, you know, those are blue screen shots. And blue screen was a real difficult thing. In other words, that was one of the most important problems that we had in visual effects, was just to be able to composite an actor in a scene without matte lines and without it looking like a postage stamp on an envelope, making it blend and feel as though it's correct. And these kind of things are like falling off a log today with the digital technology, but in those days it was extraordinarily difficult to do. And to talk about specific shots, the scene where you see them shrinking, I mean, that was murderously difficult.
You mean I'm going along?
As part of the crew, yes.
Wait a minute. They can't shrink me.
Our miniaturizer can shrink anything.
But I don't want to be miniaturized.
It's just for an hour.
Not even for a minute.
The way they did it, if you think about the camera right there that's photographing me, if the camera were to dolly back or move away from me, then I would get smaller, but everything around me would get smaller too.
The camera had to be tilted at a particular angle so that the feet didn't move. So basically what you do to make somebody look as though they're getting smaller, you have to set the camera at a particular angle, and like seconds of arc are important. I mean, it has to be nailed, and then the camera has to pull back in order to make them shrink. And if you don't have it set exactly right, then their feet start going into the ground. And then, of course, they have to be matted, so it has to be a blue screen shot on top of that. So these shots were very difficult, and there was one sequence where you see a little bit of it, and then you cut away, and then you see a little bit more, and then you cut away, and you see a little bit more. And that was done partially for reasons of continuity and wanting to cut away and see the guy with a cigar and going for another cup of coffee.
Ernst Laszlo was the director of photography for Fantastic Voyage. And one thing about, Fox, of course, developed CinemaScope in 1950s. They were known for their widescreen letterbox movies. That was their signature. The first film they did was The Robe. And then from then on, it was like, we're going to do widescreen. And widescreen is great because it brings in your peripheral vision. So as you kind of come into the theater-going experience, it wraps around a bit more, and it's a dramatic medium. It's a great aspect ratio to tell a story in, especially something like Fantastic Voyage. So if you look at those early CinemaScope pictures, they're great examples of how to use the CinemaScope frame. A lot of thought goes into it. They have the art department design shots for them. They're thinking about how to use that frame dynamically. In some ways, we lose track of some of that. I mean, because it was a new format, they really wanted to excel in it and make it look great. So quite often, looking back at these old films, early CinemaScope pictures are very influential because they're so well photographed. And Laszlo, of course, did an amazing job on that picture. One of the major things that's going on is that there are a lot of full-size sets being built and then miniature sets being built as well, and they're integrated together. The characters are often on wires, floating around on wires. In fact, if you look at the credit of the film, there's a man there that says flying sequences. I think his name is Foy, and you kind of go, what are the flying sequences? It's actually referring to the wire work or the wire work in the film.
And there was no digital wire removal in those days, so you had to use try to light out the wires, that is, paint them the color of the background, move the actors a little bit so that they would hopefully blur and you wouldn't see them. And that worked for a good portion of the time, but not all the time. So there are shots that had to be in there because of continuity where you could see the wires. And in those cases, you had to rely on the audience's suspension of disbelief.
The signature effect in the film, of course, are the point of views looking outside the sub of being inside the body, the plasma of the blood, and how that was created. Those shots were made in large tanks, large glass tanks with water, and they basically found substances like Vaseline or castor oil or anything that wouldn't mix with water. And they would eject this stuff out from the bottom of the tank and would float up toward the surface, and then they would have a camera shooting straight down at it with a big wide-angle lens. So this material would come at you sort of like a lava lamp, anything that wouldn't mix together. Oil and vinegar don't mix. And that stuff comes at you. Those would then be elements that they would mat behind the sub, or they would expose them many times over and over to sort of create this whole interior environment of cells and plasma moving around in the bloodstream.
I never imagined it could be anything like this.
I always thought it was nothing but red.
It had this kind of organic look to it, and that was the kind of thing that in the photochemical era we all had to have as part of our toolkit, and we were looking, and we had to be ingenious in finding naturally occurring physical events to photograph in order to make the audience believe that they were feeling like that they were going through a bloodstream or something like that.
The thing about Fantastic Voyage, of course, is that everything there has to be photographed by a real camera. Every element has to be created in front of that camera to be photographed. So that requires a lot of thought and innovation. And that's kind of where the magic of it is for me. These guys are conjurers. They were able to create this imagery through tricks and gags. And how do you come up with that idea of saying, well, we'll put what will be in a tank of water that will look good?
It's interesting how the state of the art of visual effects over the eras has honed the sensibilities of the audience to the point where you can't get away with anything anymore.
The best scene for me in Fantastic Voyage is when Donald Pleasence gets eaten by the corpuscle. And I think that sequence today works. You know, you couldn't make that better today. It's perfect. It's got great visual effects. You've got Donald Pleasence, who's this, you know, great actor. And, you know, he's there, you know, he's taken over the sub, he's the bad guy, he's revealed to be, you know, the menace that...
You know, I've seen some visual effects in movies that are kind of overdone, and to me they stick out because they don't encompass the sense of a filmmaker. In other words, they're too photorealistic, or there's something about them that doesn't work. I mean, there's no matte lines, but there's other giveaways. So it behooves, I think, anyone who wants to get into visual effects and master the field, you want to really understand what filmmaking is all about, and how to cut a sequence, how to, you know, because I always feel that less is more. Whenever you show the audience too much, they get bored. When you show them not quite enough, then their imagination fills in the blanks, and then they wind up thinking that they saw what you want them to see.
Give me your widest beam. Full power.